Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This is the first episode in our Christmas and New Year mini-series, in which we're returning to a common theme of this podcast and looking at a particularly important set of post-war general elections. Over the coming weeks, we're going to be looking at the elections that Edward Heath, the Conservative leader, and Harold Wilson, the Labour leader, fought between 1966 and 1974. There were 4 of them in total, in which they went head-to-head, which is really a remarkable. Try and think of other examples of so many prime ministers or party leaders going up against each other successively. It's pretty much an unprecedented period of rivalry between 2 men who were born in the same year, came from fairly similar socioeconomic backgrounds, who went to Oxford at the same time, and would sustain this great rivalry throughout much of their political career. In this episode, we're starting with 1966. Now, there are some grounds to think, although I don't encourage you to think this, that this is the most boring of the 4 elections that they fought together, as opposed to the shock, spoiler alert, by the way, here, as opposed to the shock Conservative win of 1970 or the 2 nail-biters of 1974. But I actually think we should reserve judgment on 1966, at least until the end of the podcast, as there's quite a bit more there of interest than you may have previously thought. So, Richard, this election comes after the election of 1964, which saw Harold Wilson and the Labour Party return to office. Can you begin by setting out for us a little bit of the context of the parliament that came after that election and what Labour tried to do in it?
Yeah, so Harold Wilson's first election was that 1964 election. He had taken over the leadership of the Labour Party the previous year, 1963, when Hugh Gaitskell died. And I think many thought that Labour would win that election in 1964 very comfortably. But in the end, Labour won just 317 seats, which gave it a majority of 4, which on the 100th day of the government was cut to a majority of 2 when Labour lost the seat of Leighton in a by-election, which we've done an episode on, when the incumbent Foreign Secretary was trying to get back into Parliament and he was unsuccessful in doing that, Patrick Gordon Walker. So this is a government that was trying to exist and pass legislation on the very narrowest of margins. And actually, in some respects, it did remarkably well, given the smallness of its margins. There was really pretty good discipline among Labour MPs. They knew, of course, that if they voted against the government, then this could they could be defeating their own government and possibly bringing down a Labour government. So that became a real restraining factor for MPs who might otherwise be rebellious. It's interesting that during this period, the Liberal Party offered to go into coalition with Labour to give Harold Wilson to increase his majority from 2 to 22, but Wilson declined. Wilson was not interested in forming a coalition with the Liberals. He would rather Labour carry on with this tiny majority. But of course, everyone knew that it was very unlikely that that government would last for 4 to 5 years, as theoretically it could under the terms of a standard British Parliament. And so people were looking for when Harold Wilson would go to the country and try to grow his majority, something that no Labour leader had done before.
There's a couple of themes in there that I think are quite common in politics. One of them is that having a small majority is a great disciplining force on members of Parliament. In some ways, it might seem a little odd because when there's a small majority, you do have the chance, even if you have a small little cabal within a parliamentary party, to really assert yourself. But the cost of asserting yourself could be the collapse of the government. So it does tend to be quite a disciplining measure, whereas big majorities arguably, as we've seen recently, can lead MPs to feel a little bit more indulgent. They can indulge, this sounds rather cynical as a way of phrasing it, they can indulge their conscience without feeling that there's any risk that they are going to bring down the government. This question also of when will a general election be, and everybody knowing that there was going to be another general election, is really important, because Alec Douglas-Home is the Conservative Prime Minister who leads the Conservatives into 1964. And not everybody expects him to stick around, but it's a bit of an open question. But one of the things that is keeping Douglas-Home in post is this sense that there could be another election at any time. And you can't have somebody who's just finding their feet in the role after a couple of days, weeks, or even months, when Harold Wilson goes to the palace and requests a dissolution. So it was only, in fact, when Harold Wilson signalled that there would be no general election in 1965 that gave the Conservatives the chance to replace Douglas-Home and then elect Edward Heath, because they knew that that happened in July. They then knew that it'd have at least 6 months to establish himself in the role before he goes to the country. Another thing I think it's just worth pointing out about this is that this is a period of time in which there's quite a lot of actual or de facto confidence votes being put down in the government. Quite a few votes are either being seen as confidence votes or explicit motions of no confidence in the government are being put down. One of them, for example, happens in August of 1965, really very early in Ted Heath's leadership of the Conservative Party, and the government wins that with a majority of 13. Now, that's not a razor-tight margin as such, but it's not necessarily a comfortable margin. And particularly when you're in government, an important thing for us to remember is that when you're in government, the Foreign Secretary could be over at an international conference somewhere. The Prime Minister might be doing a media trip to Scotland and can't necessarily vote. So when you've got a small majority and there's these confidence votes that are happening, it's hugely pressuring on members of parliament and particularly the people at the top of government to try and keep the show on the road and not lose a vote at any time. But Richard, I wonder if you could talk us through some of the issues that are coming up for this Labour government at the time and how they're playing out for Harold Wilson, who is, in the period of time that we're talking about until the 66 election is called, only really Prime Minister for about 18 months.
Well, it didn't begin well for the Wilson government. As we talked about in our episode about the Leighton by-election in January of 1965, the government was facing pressure on a winter pension freeze. They had frozen the state pension over the winter, and also disquiet over the issue of immigration. So, plus ça change. And I think the government reacted to that defeat by slight policy adjustments on both of those issues. So in the spring of 1965, the state pension does go up, and so the pension is unfrozen. And the government also issues a white paper on immigration called, I think, Immigration from the Commonwealth is the white paper, and it has all kinds of different policy suggestions about how to manage higher levels of immigration as Britain was experiencing in the 1960s, obviously much lower than today, but in the context of that time, higher than people had been accustomed to. So there was a sense the government was getting to grips with some of its initial mistakes. The economy was improving. And then the government had a sort of political godsend in the form of a white supremacist leader in southern Africa. So in November of 1965, the British colony of Rhodesia declared its independence from the British Empire. This was called UDI, or Unilateral Declaration of Independence. This was a time when there was a great deal of decolonization in the British Empire, but in the other instances of decolonization was done through mutual consent between the former colony and the British government. This time, you had a colony that the British government did not consent to its independence. And the reason the British government didn't consent to its independence was because they were concerned for the black population of Rhodesia, which is today Zimbabwe. Ian Smith wanted to maintain a white minority rule in Rhodesia. And the British government had a policy called NIMBAR, No Independence Without Majority Black African Rule, where they said to Smith and to the government of Rhodesia that we will not consent to Rhodesian independence until you have full multiracial democracy, or on the path to full multiracial democracy in Rhodesia, and this was unacceptable to the white population. Now, Harold Wilson responded very strongly to this unilateral declaration of independence. He led the call for international sanctions against Rhodesia. He was able to get 2 UN Security Council resolutions in short order that condemned UDI and called on the international community not to cooperate with the independent, or the self-declared independent state of Rhodesia. And he had a vote in the House of Commons on sanctions, which Labour was strongly in favour of, and the country at large generally liked a tough line against Ian Smith. But there was disquiet within the Conservative Party on this, because you had some Conservatives who thought the Wilson government was doing the right thing. In fact, Ted Heath took that view and supported sanctions. But there were a minority of Conservative MPs who didn't agree with the tough line against Ian Smith and against Rhodesia. And so Ted Heath actually held a free vote, an unwhipped vote on sanctions. And a couple of dozen Conservative MPs actually voted against sanctions on the Smith regime.
Throughout this mini-series, there are a couple of big issues that will recur where the parties are internally divided. One of the biggest ones that we'll come on to quite a bit, of course, is the question of Europe and Labour's internal divisions on Europe. But it's quite interesting that before that really comes to the fore in a more dramatic way in this period of time, there are these questions about decolonisation and about sanctions. And Wilson, it seems to me, plays it quite smartly in terms of trying to force the issue that will expose the divides within the Conservative Party. And Heath probably does the only thing that he really can do when you've got a divided party in which people have got strong opinions, of have a free vote. But when people know what you think in a free vote, and you're of course voting in that yourself as also an MP and a party leader, and particularly when it's over an issue which is not always a free vote question. So perhaps when there's a moral question that's being put to the House of Commons, a little bit like the assisted dying bill has quite recently, then everybody accepts from the very beginning that that is going to be a free vote. And therefore, if you vote in a different way to your leader, it's not seen as being rebellious. Questions of sanctions and foreign policy are not obviously questions of conscience, and therefore not obviously free votes. And so even though Heath calls it a free vote, the fact that there are dozens of Conservative MPs in a different lobby to him really does make his party look divided, and his leadership, I think, look pretty weak.
Absolutely. So Wilson exploits these divisions in the Conservative Party. His standing in the public goes up. His approval rating eventually reaches 60% of the public say they approve the job that the Prime Minister is doing. Keir Starmer would probably murder a few people to get that kind of rating today. He's, what is he, 11% approval? I think that's Starmer and the PLP and their family members, basically,
Yes, I know, absolutely.
at this stage. Dick Crossman, who features quite a lot in this, he was Labour's Housing and Local Government Secretary. He was also the chief strategist for Labour in the 1966 election, described the Rhodesia crisis as Harold Wilson's Cuba. And what he meant by that was it was an allusion to John F. Kennedy, who at the start of his presidency faced a crisis in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs crisis, actually one of something of Kennedy's own making. But Kennedy was seen to have effectively saved the world and brought the US and the Soviet Union back from the brink of a nuclear showdown, and it established Kennedy's credentials as a wise strategic mind, and Crossman saw it in that way. So Crossman believed at that point that the government's handling of Rhodesia was able to paper over some of the cracks that still existed in the government's domestic record, where although things had improved to a certain extent, there was still quite a lot of unresolved issues, including the public finances and this issue that plagued the Wilson government of the 60s, which was the value of the pound, which would eventually become a major problem for the government later on.
So it's really quite a roller coaster 18 months, really, then for Wilson and his new government. So, like you say, quite unpopular to begin with, by-election defeats like in Leighton, but then on a couple of issues, not least sanctions on Rhodesia, manages to assert itself and assert Wilson, I think, as a rather more effective prime minister than many people had thought at the beginning. One thing that also begins to happen over this period is that the opinion polls are improving, and not just Harold Wilson's own ratings, but the way in which people say they would vote in a general election. That must have tempted Wilson. He must have been tempted for quite a few months, really, over the Christmas and into the early New Year, to go for an election. But of course, it's always difficult. It's difficult now, it's difficult then, to know to what extent should you really trust opinion polls. Opinion polls in the 1960s, I think, actually had quite a good record for accuracy, helped in part by the fact that there are two major parties and there's quite stable voting blocks behind both of them. And the polls were good, but sometimes you want a little bit of extra validation before you really decide to lay your government on the line. And that is what the Hull North by-election enables Wilson to do, to really get that validation that gives him the confidence to go to the country.
Yes, so the MP for Hull North was a chap called Harry Solomons, and he'd only been elected in 1964. It was a Labour gain. So he was a new MP. He had never been in Parliament before. He'd been a trade union official, but he was in his 60s and not in great health. And partly as a consequence of what you were talking about earlier, Lee, about all these very close divisions, of all of these long late night sittings, Solomon's health worsened over the course of those months as an MP. And in one instance, he actually collapsed in the House of Commons during a late night sitting. And when it was determined that he was not dead, they decided to keep him in the parliamentary estate so that he could be nodded through for the purposes of the division before he was taken to hospital. So you can see just sort of how these were such close run things. And eventually Solomons did die and created a vacancy in Hull North. So the Labour government now is down to a majority of just one. And this is a way for the government to see is the perception that's been picked up on in the polls actually reflected on the ground in reality, because Hull North was a marginal seat. Labour had only won it by 1,100 votes at the previous general election. But when the by-election finally took place on the 27th of January 1966, the Labour majority grew nearly fivefold to 5,351. So this is a very good result for Labour. It was a significant swing, particularly by swinging to the governing party. That's quite remarkable as well. Often people use by-elections as an opportunity to take a free hit at the government. There may have been, some people claim there may have been some unfair tipping of the scales in this election, because the Transport Secretary, Barbara Castle, wrote a letter expressing that it was her intention, the government's intention, to build a bridge between Grimsby and Hull, the Humber Bridge, which had been a long-standing aspiration of a kind of transport project. In the end, the Humber Bridge wasn't completed until Margaret Thatcher's premiership. But at the time, the Humber Bridge, it was actually quite a remarkable feat. It was the largest single suspension bridge in the world at the time that it was built. And the business case for it was not so strong necessarily, but it meant a lot to the people who lived in that part of the country. And so some people say that Barbara Castle kind of gave an additional boost to Labour's good result in the Hull North by-election.
So the promise of a bridge comes up in basically every Tory memoir of this period, and is usually described as being the biggest electoral bribe in history, which, which may be it. Well, I actually suspect that's been eclipsed quite a few times over in the years since. But clearly that result, whether it was earned by a bribe or a favourable underlying position for the Labour Party, gives Wilson the confidence to go for it. So what are the mechanisms then of Wilson calling the election, and when is the election set for?
Well, after the whole North by-election, everyone thinks that a general election is going to be called soon, and it's a question of how soon rather than if. Now, looking at Dick Crossman's diaries, we see that Harold Wilson was actually talking to Crossman about having a March election before the whole North by-election. So Crossman records in his diary on the Sunday before polling day in the whole North by-election that he and Wilson met, and Wilson expressed his desire for an election in March. But perhaps if Labour had lost Hull North, then maybe Wilson might have changed his mind. It takes him another few weeks, in fact, basically a month, before he makes the announcement that he's going to dissolve Parliament and call an election. But there's no dissent when he does. The cabinet is fully behind him. They viewed it as a necessity, basically. And, well, we'll come to discuss this, but I think by any metric, this is one of the best timed elections in British history.
It's a good example as well of the power of a prime minister to use the prerogative to dissolve parliament and call a general election. This is an example, like you say, of it being used very well. Almost all elections ultimately have been called on the basis of when a prime minister thinks is a good time to call an election, or if there is no good time to call an election, then generally at the last minute that a prime minister thinks a government can either not survive or whenever the parliament has basically expired. But this is an example, I think, of it being used well and also being an effective feature of the Constitution. It's not any use really to insist on governments who want to go back to the country staying in office and continuing with a really poor majority that means they're limiting their own parliamentary agenda. Nor is it obvious to me, because I know this has obviously been a controversial feature of the British constitution and electoral system over the years, not least the reasons why we had a Fixed Term Parliament Act that was insisted upon by the Liberal Democrats and passed by the coalition government, since then repealed. But it's not clear to me why an arbitrary date in the calendar is any better basis for calling a general election than when the Prime Minister thinks it should be called, particularly given that what's being put on the line is his or her ability to remain in office. We're just going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll discuss the opening rounds of the election and what the Labour and the Conservative messages were. We're back. So, Richard, Heath really tries to go all guns blazing in the very early stages of this election. He knows he's a relatively inexperienced leader. He's not particularly well known in the country. He's only been in post for 6 months or so. And he's up against a prime minister who is proving to be, at this stage, quite popular. And he falls back to a pretty long-standing request of opposition party leaders to try and insert himself into the debate.
Yes, so quite literally, Heath challenges Harold Wilson to a televised debate. You have to remember this isn't that long after the famous American presidential televised debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy in 1960, which captured the popular imagination. And in 1964, Wilson had challenged Alec Douglas Hume, the then Prime Minister, to a debate. And Douglas Hume didn't want to have a debate because I suppose the worry there is you elevate the leader of the opposition as your equal. And so he declined. So Heath, rather trying to be quite clever, thought, well, now I'll reverse the table and I will, as leader of the opposition, challenge Harold Wilson to a debate. This was now awkward because Wilson didn't want a debate for the very same reasons that Alec Douglas Hume had not wanted to debate him. So he comes up with a clever idea where he says, well, I'm open to a debate, but I believe that we need the three party leaders on the debate stage. We need Mr. Joe Grimmond, the Liberal Party leader, also to be part of this debate. And part of what Wilson was hoping to do, in a sense, was to diminish Heath's standing by taking out this sense that he was the prime minister in waiting and that they were sort of equivalents, and also perhaps to alarm Heath of the prospect of Grimmond doing quite well. He was, I think, quite a sort of photogenic and eloquent individual. And if he did do particularly well in the debate, then that might cost some Tory votes in rural England and other parts of the UK, which could be to the detriment of the Tories. So then he sort of had to sheepishly withdraw the offer.
It's amazing how often over the years the question of a debate has been raised in the lead up to a general election, and surprising really that it took until 2010 for it to come about, because this is a device that is used most often by the people who think they're going to lose an election or think they are the least well-known quantity within an election in almost every campaign. But obviously it's only in 2010, when Gordon Brown is sufficiently desperate and David Cameron doesn't really feel like he can say no, as somebody who's trying to have a vote for change message and trying to really have a new way of doing politics, particularly after the MP's expenses scandal, which we discussed a few weeks ago. It's only in 2010 that it actually comes about.
And then when Cameron's prime minister and there are further debates, Cameron insists on having all the small party leaders on the stage in that debate, basically trying to do something like what Wilson wanted to do with Heath by sort of diluting the main opposition with the other parties. And I think that David Cameron sort of hoped that he would, as the incumbent prime minister, sort of be seen to be head and shoulders above the rest of the pack.
You can see to some degree as well why it would be quite useful for Wilson to say that the Liberals should be in. Some people might wonder or raise their eyebrows about that, because it's seen as having a second party that's often seen as a party of the left. I know not a view that you hold, and we've discussed only very recently, but people often would see that as being two parties of the left, so surely that would actually harm Wilson. Why is he suggesting it? But at the time, the Liberals are not only a very small party, they're led by Joe Grimmond as an old Etonian, a very good and charismatic politician. They'll soon be led by another charismatic old Etonian in Jeremy Thorpe. It's quite an interesting sort of socially exclusive party almost by this stage. Joe Grimmond is also married to part of the Asquith family. It's basically a small aristocracy of the remaining rump of liberal England, basically. And that is seen as being more of a threat to the Conservatives, more than it is seen as being a threat to the Labour Party. So the campaign begins. Wilson's got his dissolution. What are the big messages that the Labour Party is trying to take out to the country?
Well, actually, before the campaign begins, a few weeks earlier, in early February of 1966, Harold Wilson convenes a special conference at Chequers, where he invites the cabinet, the Labour National Executive Committee, which would have consisted of senior MPs and also representatives of the trade unions, to come together for an all-day conference at Chequers. They had the Prime Minister from 10:30 in the morning until 6:30 in the evening. And they went through, and Wilson had basically every member of the cabinet present what they had been doing in government and what they would like to do if Labour was elected to another term and had a proper majority to deliver on it. And then Wilson invited comment and feedback in this discussion. As the reports of this were that it went very well, and it enabled the left of the party, which had representatives on the NEC. It enabled the trade unions, some of the backbench Labour MPs, to air their concerns. And then Wilson was very skillful at kind of making it seem like he'd listened to what they had to say, and then explain what the government would do about it. And although this wasn't formally a consultation for a manifesto, That's basically what the participants were led to believe. And in the end, it was very successful. Wilson had effectively got all the different wings of the party to consent to a manifesto that they had not yet seen, that actually had not yet been written, and made them feel that they had bought into this. And in effect, Wilson had got them to dip their hands in blood, proverbially speaking. Wilson had actually learned this tactic from Clement Attlee, because Attlee did the same thing in 1950. Shortly before the 1950 general election, he didn't bring them to Chequers, he brought them to the Isle of Wight, both the NEC and the cabinet, and there was a 2-day-long conference at the it's called the Shanklin Conference in Shanklin, which is in the Isle of Wight, in the Manor House Hotel, where they basically did the same thing. And of course, we have to remember Harold Wilson was a member of that Attlee cabinet, so he saw what Attlee had done, and then he replicated it in 1966. Generally speaking, the manifesto was very carefully constructed, with a reasonable degree of ambiguity in it. And so in some ways, actually what mattered for the Labour campaign more than policy was personality. And indeed, the figure of Harold Wilson himself became Labour's greatest asset in the campaign. Dick Crossman writes, "Harold's personality has played a leading part. He is winning just by being himself and carrying the lower middle class vote. Never have I known an election as easy as this one. We have been fighting 1959 in reverse. Now it is we who are on top of the world. The Tories can't find a way to break through the complacent acceptance by the electorate of Super Harold." So there's this sense that Harold Wilson is, for the first time in people's living memory, I suppose for the first time ever, really. Ramsay MacDonald is a slightly different case, but he is someone who comes from from the lower middle classes, and is a good communicator. He's very sharp, he's very witty, and he's seen to be a good manager. And this becomes a big asset for Labour in the campaign.
One of the tragedies from a Conservative side about this campaign is that Ted Heath was made leader in July 1965, really to be the Tory party's answer to Harold Wilson. As I said at the outset, fairly similar socioeconomic backgrounds, both very bright, both went to Oxford. But where there is a big difference, quite a few differences that'll be fleshed out in this series, but where there is a big difference is that Wilson has got this great, easy charm as a communicator, which Ted Heath just never really develops. And unfortunately for him and for the Conservative Party, that becomes quite clear, really, in the early stages of his leadership. So there's quite a bit of criticism of him in the early months. It's mostly quiet. For example, Douglas Hurd, who was his political secretary, wrote in his diary that Heath was, quote, "never superb, always adequate, sometimes good." I mean, it's hardly high praise from one of your closest advisors. And sometimes that criticism even spilt out into the public. So Angus Maude, who was a front bencher at this time, wrote a piece for the Spectator, which was basically focused on the challenges that the Conservative Party faced, but made quite a few digs at the leadership of Ted Heath, even if not always by name, including a dig at the technocratic style of leadership that was not going to win the party the next general election. Angus Maude was in fact sacked for writing this article. That's how much of a dig it was seen as being at Ted Heath. Nevertheless, one of the challenges I think that the Conservatives face at this time is that it's only 18 months since they were last in office. When they were in office, they were there for 13 years. The party does not appear to be fresh, really, in any respect. It's not been a long enough period for people to look at the Tories with new eyes. But the one thing that they do have that appears somewhat fresh about them is their leader. Ted Heath has not led them into an election before. So they end up in this quite difficult situation in which they have a leader who is not really working out, but he is nevertheless their asset in the campaign. So he's front and centre throughout in the party election broadcasts and elsewhere.
And Labour figures recognised Heath's difficulties as a campaigner. Dick Crossman said that Heath came across as, quote, "terribly stiff and starchy. he remained right to the end a curiously synthetic character. And Ted Heath, of course, was a lifelong bachelor. He never married. And Harold Wilson had a fairly prominent prime ministerial spouse in his wife, Mary, someone who, uh, was known to the public and was seen as a sort of sympathetic character in the eyes of the public. And it's interesting. Harold Wilson says to Dick Crossman that it's a positive advantage that he and Mary are seen together on the campaign trail, whereas Heath has no one with him, and that will also build into this sense of contrast between Wilson as a recognizable figure and Heath as a bit of an oddball.
Well, to try and overcome this idea of Heath the bachelor, the Tories basically try and develop the concept of Heath the action man. So the word action is used consistently about the Tory message at this time. The manifesto is called Action, Not Words. It contains a 131-point action plan for the country, and that focuses on some recurring conservative themes for government and also going into this election. So the three key messages that the Tories really try and promote in this campaign are trade union relations and the fact that they need reform, Labour's mismanagement of the economy and what the Conservatives would do differently, and also welfare and the need for welfare reform. Just to comment on them briefly, Heath basically has the view that almost all of Britain has been modernised in recent years, particularly in the post-war years under Attlee and then the Conservative governments of 1951 to 64. But that the trade unions and their relationship to industry and their relationship to the government and the wider political economy of the country are basically as they were at the beginning of the 20th century. So he sees that the trade union movement as being in desperate need of modernisation. There was a period early in the campaign where it seems that this could be a hot button issue. There has been a strike in Oxford, an unofficial strike, in which 4 people have returned to work. And there basically becomes a bit of a mock show trial in the workplace of these 4 people who went back to work. And as this is taking place, it gets reported that there was a hangman's noose or a bit of rope that was tied to look like a hangman's noose in the corner of the room. And this was used as an example of extremism and militancy within the trade union movement that Heath tried to make a part of the campaign, but in truth, it never really took off. On the economy, Heath came up with this phrase that the country had the problem of 951. 9% rise in wages, 5% rise in prices, but only a 1% rise in productivity. And he basically tried to make the argument that this was unsustainable. And as indeed it is in the longer term, that was not an illegitimate critique to make. But a big problem for the Tories in that sense was that things like wage growth and inflation and levels of productivity, these aren't things that happen overnight on the whim of short-term government policies necessarily. They're often things that are baked into an economy over the longer term. And it's not all that long at all, since the Conservatives themselves were in office and people were talking about some of the similar challenges. So it seems a bit too quick to turn around and say, actually, this is all because of you, particularly when there aren't really, as there are now, to make a bit of a contrast with today's politics, there aren't really flagship Labour policies that have been implemented on the economy, where somebody can point the finger and say, well, that's what's caused this issue. There isn't really the equivalent of Rachel Reeves' rise in employers' national insurance that has arguably led to higher unemployment that people can jump on. So it becomes a difficult message to land on the economy for the Conservatives.
And also, one thing just to say is, if you see a 9% increase in your wages and only a 5% increase in prices, well, that's a good thing. I mean, you feel like you've got more disposable income. Whether that's sustainable or not is maybe another matter. But from the perspective of the individual voter, they are probably feeling more flush than they used to. The government also had some good fortune in the February trade figures being very favorable to the government. This is a time when people really used to be very preoccupied with this notion of the balance of trade. And And so people, it was a sort of, in the way that we talk about unemployment, for example, and of course they talked about unemployment then, but the balance of trade figures that would be released on a monthly basis became one way of testing the health of the economy. And it just so happened that the February figures were very good for the government. So I think that also took some of the wind out of the Conservative sails on their economic criticism of the government.
I think that's right. Just finally, on the Conservative message and the attempt to try and communicate a vision to the country, Heath would speak during this election campaign as wanting to create a new beverage. Of course, William Beveridge was the man who authored the Beveridge Report during the Second World War, and which basically gave the underpinning principles of the welfare state as it was developed under the Attlee government. One of the general principles of welfarism as it developed was universalism, that there wouldn't be a means test around who got welfare. In some respects, that has remained a feature of British welfare policy, most famously with things like the winter fuel payment until last year, where the winter fuel payment went to everybody, whether they were the poorest or the richest of pensioners. And Heath was quite keen on this idea of making sure that you could focus welfare spending on the people who needed it most and breaking the principle of universalism. All of these things that the Conservatives were saying and that Heath was saying in the campaign were, I think, in and of themselves, perfectly reasonable things to say, and in other contexts and in other campaigns could have been seen as very effective messaging to try and appeal to swing voters in the country. He even had quite a good slogan that he used about it. He would talk about vote Labour, pay later. It's got a slight hint of Rishi Sunak in 2024, perhaps, about it. Well, again, a similarly cursed campaign in terms of what the outcome was. Although I think Rishi Sunak feels as if he's been vindicated by events since then. But nevertheless, in spite of having these quite coherent messages from the Conservative side, it never feels like it's really cutting through in the campaign. And as the campaign develops, an election that Tories thought was never really theirs to be won, they become convinced there's really not going to be one at all.
Yes, it does seem like the dial is not moving very much in that campaign, although I think in hindsight, there probably was a little bit of a decline in the Labour vote towards the very end of the campaign. But Barbara Castle's assessment of this campaign was that the public had made up their mind at the start and they didn't change their minds over the course of the campaign.
There is, in fact, one other issue that I should talk about, which the Conservatives tried to use a little bit, and that is a theme that we will be returning to a lot, and that is Europe. So, of course, in 1963, there were plans for the United Kingdom to enter the European Economic Community, the SIX, as it was at the time. And Edward Heath, in the years leading up to that, had basically been the person negotiating what British entry would look like with what is now the European Union. But in January 1963, Charles de Gaulle, the French president, said no. He vetoed the British attempt to join, and that was that. At the time, the Conservatives were much more the pro-European party than the Labour Party was, for reasons that we've discussed previously on this podcast. And Heath himself is very committed to the idea of Britain joining Europe. So going into the election, the Conservative message is basically that they will seize the first favourable opportunity to join the European Economic Community. And to some degree, this does present a bit of a challenge for Harold Wilson, because he has quite a few MPs who also agree with Heath and are keen on that message and do want to be in Europe. But Wilson manages to keep his party together really quite effectively and come up with this effective, some ways quite damaging critique of Heath, where Wilson can say, look, we're not wholly against it, but there has to be the right arrangements for the United Kingdom in terms of European policies on agriculture, for example, whereas Heath and the Conservatives will simply, and this is the phrase that Wilson used, roll on his back like a spaniel at any kind gesture from the French. So it's rather an effective criticism, I think, of Wilson to turn what is this weakness for him, in a sense, that his party is divided on the question of Britain and Europe, into an impression of Heath as being a weak leader, desperate to get in at almost any price and delighted at any compliment he can get from the continent. We're just going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back to look at attempts to inject a little bit of drama into the short campaign, and then what the verdict of the voters is when they go to the polls. Okay, so Richard, I did say at the outset that there is an argument that this is a fairly dull general election, certainly compared to 70 or the two votes of 1974. But there were certainly moments of drama as well.
Yeah, so this election is famed for its heckling. There was a BBC documentary called The Hecklers about the 1966 election, which is a fantastic piece of political history. It used to be on iPlayer. It may still be on BBC iPlayer. It's well worth a watch. You get to see something of the way, the old style that politicians campaigned on their soapboxes or on their stages with a sort of a call and response type arrangement with the electorate. There is one particular, well, there are quite a few uh, moments of high drama in that campaign with respect to hecklers. At one point, Harold Wilson is hit in the eye with a stink bomb, but Wilson, ever being the clever campaigner, he then immediately offers back by saying, with an aim like that, that boy ought to be in the English 11. So it then becomes a sort of a bit of a joke, and he sort of gets the better edge of it. There were times when the issue of Rhodesia in particular riled up some of these right-wing hecklers against Labour politicians. And one heckler talks about Wilson wanting to hand over Rhodesia to barbarians, basically a racist allusion to black Rhodesians who became Zimbabweans. And Wilson says, I don't know about handing over governments to barbarians, but we seem to allow barbarians to come to our meetings. Basically, Wilson was really good at this, but there were other politicians who were quite skilled at this. One on the Tory side was Quintin Hogg, who had a curious manner about him when he was heckled, where he also liked to sort of give as good as he got. There's one part in this documentary where he's been heckled by these long-haired students who are unhappy about I don't know, Vietnam and in general the forces of conservatism, one might say. And Hogg shouts back at one of the long-haired students, with your hair so long, I can't tell, are you a little girl or a little boy? And sort of completely humiliates the heckler.
Hailsham in particular was, I think, was a great platform speaker at these sorts of events, a demand that's not necessarily required of politicians today because of the decline of public meetings in general. But Hailsham always had the slight air, though, of you got the slight feeling he was drunk almost when he was doing it. When he'd make comments like that, or when he was out in public, and some people started chanting at him, "We want Wilson," and Hailsham just picks up his stick. I don't know why he's carrying a stick necessarily, and just starts whacking these posters out of people's hands and trying to smash up the face of Harold Wilson on these Labour posters. So it's an amazingly combustible political atmosphere in some ways. And I think in one of the ways in which you can see really the last quarter of a millennium in English and British politics has almost been the sanitization of campaigning, where you used to get huge amounts of this, I mean, violence at the polls and in elections. And then even half a century or so ago, you've still got these public meetings where it's not just for supporters. Critics will turn out as well, and they'll really give it a go and try and shout somebody down and heckle them, as that documentary shows so brilliantly.
In a sense,
But
it was a great British tradition. And
yeah,
I think the public would go to these meetings in hope and expectation that there would be hecklers, and they would judge a politician on the basis of how good they were at responding to the hecklers. It was almost a sort of part of the program for a campaign rally.
and any good politician, of course, would know that and would have some pre-prepared lines. Like, I rather suspect that line, of Wilson's about playing for the England cricket team, he probably had in the back of his mind, right, if somebody throws something at me, this is my go-to gag. Because being prepared is a huge part of what effective spontaneity looks like. You've got to prepare for it. From the Conservative side, there are only a few rare moments of drama or particular excitement in the campaign. One of them was when Ted Heath was flying into Aberdeen, or being flown into Aberdeen on this plane that they had chartered, and one of the windows blew out on the aircraft, and there was this great suction of people's papers, and a journalist's notebook was flung out of the window by this, and Heath reached over to grab the journalist in question, fearing that he might be next out of the window. It's actually a little bit less dramatic than it sounds in one respect, because they were only at about 2,000 feet. So the pressure difference was not so much that he was really that likely to get sucked out of the window. The clangor really that stuck in Heath's mind during the campaign, when he looked back on this years later, although he never really thought it was of much significance, and that's probably true, is that he tried to attack Wilson as being all about gimmickry and being quite a shallow politician, a showman rather than a statesman, basically. And one of the ways in which he tried to allude to this is by saying that in a month's time, Harold Wilson will no doubt be having tea in number 10 Downing Street with a pregnant panda, all for the photo opportunity. Now, aside from the fact that it's slightly odd comment in and of itself, in a month's time, it was going to be after the general election. So the implication of Heath's attack was that in a month's time, Harold Wilson would still be in number 10, which was in fact what he expected. It's what Wilson expected. It's what most people expected. But of course, you do have to go through an election campaign pretending that any outcome is possible.
Things were going so smoothly that Dick Crossman, the strategist for the Labour Party campaign, thought that an air of drama needed to be inserted into the campaign. And so the day after Harold Wilson had been hit by the stink bomb, Dick Crossman was visiting Wilson in 10 Downing Street. They had daily meetings at the very start of the day during the campaign. It was so early that Harold Wilson used to do these meetings from bed, where Crossman would sit at the edge of the bed and Wilson would be in bed, usually eating his breakfast, which was usually kippers, and he would eat his kippers. And then Crossman describes Wilson, as he finished a kipper, flinging the skeleton on the floor for his cat, Nemo, a Siamese cat, to lick at. It's a sort of odd image. And Crossman says to Wilson, perhaps you can use the stink bomb attack as an excuse for removing yourself from the campaign for a couple of days, saying that you're recovering from some kind of illness that's been inflicted as a result of this attack. And then on Saturday before polling day, you can return to the campaign in a great big rally in Manchester, and you'll sort of have, in effect, kind of risen from the dead, and everyone will be interested in seeing is the Prime Minister all right? What's the Prime Minister like? And then you'll come out in a blaze of glory. Well, Wilson was a bit sceptical of this. He was due to go to Norwich that day, and he said to Crossman, but suppose I don't go to Norwich today, how shall I spend the afternoon? And Crossman says, well, you could try governing the country. To which Wilson laughs and says, oh no, there are no boxes coming upstairs now in number 10. There's no work for me here. I would just sit about. And then Crossman said, all right, Harold, you being you, that's surely something you can't do. You can't just sit about. So if you really feel that you're at a loose end today and you want to go to Norwich, you can do so. So in the end, Wilson does go to Norwich and give this speech, and Crossman says he's glad that Wilson didn't take his advice because it ended up being one of Wilson's greatest speeches of the campaign.
It's also, I think, just a properly stupid strategy. A, to lie, because if the lie gets out, you're in big trouble. B, to suggest that your own leader is ill, so ill that he can't even give speeches, just a week or so before a general election polling day. and also because of the context, right? That Wilson became leader of the Labour Party because his predecessor died in post. So I don't think you really want to go around suggesting that leaders of your party are ill and putting that doubt, that grain of sand that's unlikely to turn into a pearl, into the minds of the voters.
Harold Wilson's political secretary, Marcia Williams, in fact, had a dream during the campaign that Harold Wilson was dead. And in her dream, she kept saying, "He's not dead. I don't believe you." And then they brought her to the corpse of Harold Wilson, where she finally was made to believe that he was dead. She told this story to Tony Benn, but she didn't share it with Harold Wilson.
I'd hope not. Well, the 31st of March 1966 is polling day, and the country goes to the polls and casts their votes. And the election result is a landslide victory for Harold Wilson and the Labour Party. So, to give you the headline figures, Wilson won 364 seats. That's up 47 on the 1964 election. And he did that with 48% of the vote, or just over 13 million votes. For the Conservatives, Ted Heath won 253 seats. That's down 51. And that was with 41.9, so just under 42% of the vote, or 11.5 million votes. So that's about a 6% lead for Labour in the polls. For the Liberal Party, it's both a pleasing and a disappointing outcome. So they win 12 seats. That's up 3 from the election before. They do so with 2.3 million votes and about 8.5% of the vote. Now, for them, it's rather curious because their vote share is down by 2.7 percentage points, but the number of seats that they managed to win is up. So there's positives and negatives for the Liberals, all positives for Wilson, and pretty much all negatives for Heath. Now, this is a couple of things that just stand out to me about this before we analyse really what happened there. First of all, is that the turnout is relatively low. So, the turnout is high by the standards of today, but at 75.8%, it's a relatively low turnout. The lowest, in fact, since 1945, when there were very good reasons why turnout was quite low in that election. This is the highest Labour vote share in any election from 1966 onwards. So 48% of the vote has never been beaten by any of Harold Wilson's successors, or indeed by Harold Wilson himself in the next 3 general elections. And Richard, as you say, this is the first time that Labour gains seats in office.
Yes, and the only other time that it happens is in the election of October 1974, also under Harold Wilson, which will bookend this series on the Wilson v. Heath elections.
And to really wrap this subject up, I thought we could basically give some reflections each on what really stands out to us about this election, the outcome and its consequences. So, Richard, why don't you kick us off with that?
I guess 2 key reflections. The first is about the importance of timing. This election was, as I said at the start, probably one of the best timed elections in the history of the Labour Party, where had Harold Wilson gone any later, then the economic situation probably would have deteriorated sufficiently that Labour could have lost power rather than have won in a landslide. Wilson was, I think, aware of this possibility. Indeed, Wilson decided that he was dead set on having the election in March of 1966 rather than even April, because April would have been after the budget. And he thought that the budget was going to do some things, for example, particularly when it came to rates, local taxation, that would be unpopular. So he timed it very well in that respect. The second the second observation I have is about the consequences of this landslide for the Harold Wilson government. We usually see, or we've been accustomed to thinking that a landslide is a good thing for a political party. And yet sometimes landslides can be real curses. In some ways, Keir Starmer is probably experiencing something of this at the moment. And Dick Crossman was, I think, very perspicacious in writing in his diary the day after the election about his foreboding as to what this election result would mean. He wrote, "We ministers will have a far more difficult time in handling the backbenchers. Now they are liberated from the constraints of a tiny majority. All those Labour MPs who gritted their teeth and just voted with their feet and weren't allowed to speak or influence anything will be seething with life and vitality and energy and an active desire to take an active part in policy making. On all of the great issues that we will have to resolve, we shall have to carry the parliamentary party with us far more intimately than ever before, and that requires an entirely different style of party management. And the second observation that Crossman made is that a lot of the Labour MPs who were elected in 1966 for the first time were of a different socioeconomic background to Labour MPs elected in 1964, where in Crossman's observation, you had a lot more people who were from the middle classes, people who were teachers, people who were journalists, lawyers, scientists. And Crossman said that these people are going to be particularly difficult to manage because they don't have that same kind of sense of collective, the same kind of collective mindset that someone who would be a trade union sponsored MP might have. And I suppose part of the reason for this is because Labour won a lot of seats that were market town seats, county town seats, Oxford, Cambridge, Lancaster, York, Bedford. And in many of these seats, there wasn't a dominant industry in the way in which there were in sort of Labour's heartland seats. And where you had a dominant industry, you would usually have a trade union or two that would have disproportionate weight in the selection of the local parliamentary candidate. Whereas in these places, it was often, I mean, as is the case today in the Labour Party, school teachers who are the members who are voting for fellow school teachers to be their parliamentary candidates. And so Crossman says, look out for these people because they're going to cause more trouble for the Labour government. And as it happened, that 66 to 70 Labour government was a much less happy one, I think, for Harold Wilson than the governments that he led in 64 to 66 or 74 to 76, which had much smaller, or in the case of 1974, no majority at all. Lee, what are your observations of this election?
Yeah, so two final observations from me, really. One of them is about the importance of sometimes looking under the bonnet of an election result. And you can see there's some interesting trends or some things which end up exaggerating the result one way or another. So when the vote comes about in 1966, the last time there was a boundary review of parliamentary constituencies is 1954. And in the intervening period, there's been a depopulation of cities and large towns, and there's been a growing population in the southeast and in some counties. So what you end up having by 1966 is very large Conservative seats, particularly in the home counties and the southern counties, and really quite small Labour constituencies, particularly in some parts of the north, and particularly in inner city urban areas, which also have relatively low turnout as well. So underneath the headline figures are some electoral phenomena which, A, mean that Labour's vote is extremely efficiently cast in the election to give them a good number of seats, which is something that you always want to have as a political party. You want efficient distribution of your voters. And B, that there is a slight exaggeration of the Labour majority. So it's probable that Labour's majority was about 10 to 30 bigger than it would have been if there were totally equal seats across the country. It's hard to predict exactly, but that's probably the case. It's not a partisan point I'm making there necessarily. In 1950 and 1951, the electoral geography benefited the Conservative Party to the extent that Labour got more votes in an election and the Conservatives won more seats. So it's not a fixed thing that benefits Labour or the Conservatives, but it did benefit the Labour Party in this election. And the final thought from me, really, is that I see the 1966 election almost not as its own thing, but almost as the continuation of the 1964 general election. So going into the 1964 poll, people thought that the Conservatives would lose, that this was a change election, and that Labour would get in. But they managed to get in with just a majority of 4 or 5, depending on how you calculate it. And some parts of the country that stuck with the Conservatives really in terms of the national swing in 1964, like the Midlands, for example, are the areas that swing most markedly towards the Labour Party in 1966. So it's almost as if you have this geographically disparate election that takes place in 2 stages, 64 and 66, where different parts of the country move away from the Conservatives and towards Wilson and Labour in 2 stages. And so to some degree, why I combine those 2 elections together in my mind is that these become elections that are still about a judgment on 13 years of Conservative government, as well as about the potential of a Labour government if it gets a proper majority. That quite similar themes and similar judgments are going on in both contests. But what will change by 1970 is that Labour will have a majority, a big majority, and going into that election, there's nowhere for Wilson to hide, and it will very much be an election for which he is held accountable for what he's delivered in government. We finish each episode, as we always do, with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. Richard, why don't you go first?
This week I read White Identity Politics by Ashley Jardina. This is a book that came out in 2019. It's a book about the non-trivial proportion of white Americans who say that their white racial identity is meaningful and important to them. Jardina estimates that this is between 30 and 40% of white Americans. And it's quite interesting because as one of my other areas of research interest has been race and politics in the United States. And a lot of the literature on particularly African-American politics, which I've written quite a bit about, talks about the importance of Black racial identity and Black racial solidarity and how that is politically meaningful to many African-American voters and helps to explain phenomena such as why do a majority of Black conservatives still vote for the Democratic Party, even if they don't actually agree with the Democratic Party on many areas of policy. And Jardina says, okay, a lot of attention's been put on how racial identity matters for different minority groups in the United States. Well, let's see how racial identity matters for the majority, the majority racial group in the United States. And it's a difficult and delicate area in some ways, but she frames this discussion not in terms of thinking of white racial identity purely as some kind of form of white supremacy or outward hostility to other groups, but she looks at why white Americans think of themselves as white and what that means to them, and for those who think it is meaningful to them, how that might shape the way that they participate in politics. So it's a fascinating book. It's a difficult topic in some ways for people to talk about. I think that she does a fantastic job of having a pretty social scientific approach to an issue which could, if it was done, I think, by a less skilled author, go in some unpleasant directions, but I think that she writes about it in a really interesting way. Lee, what is your book this week?
So this week I've been reading The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. It's a novella, really, so it comes in at under 100 pages, and it's a much celebrated book. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1953, and also when Ernest Hemingway was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, it was cited as being one of the reasons why he won the award. I must say, I've not enjoyed it all that much. That might be because I don't have a great sense of fishing or open sea fishing or marlin fishing that I can really get my head around. So sometimes the book itself is parts of it escape me. And at times it feels quite slow. It's basically got one plot point. Now, one plot point that is very much explored in detail in terms of fishing and the desperation of an old man who's trying to catch this great fish. He hasn't caught a fish in 87 days by the time he sets out to sea by himself to try and catch it. So there's great themes in there about sort of desperation and determination. There's also some pretty bloody descriptions about the catching and the killing of a dolphin, which if you've got a slightly delicate sensitivity, you may not like quite so much. But it's, yeah, at times I felt I struggled with it. But what was quite curious is when I thought, gosh, maybe I'm a little bit bored by this book, and thought, then, well, maybe I'll just read a couple more pages. I found that those couple more pages actually propelled me forward to about 10 or 12 pages, and then I was further on with it and felt more emotionally invested in what was happening in the determination to catch this giant marlin. So it's a well celebrated book, and if you do want to spend some time reading it, it will only really take you a couple of hours. It's possibly the shortest book you can read this Christmas. We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all from us this week. We'll be back next weekend with a look at the 1970 general election, that second date with the electors for both Edward Heath and Harold Wilson. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.